What starts out as an ordinary walk with your favorite Dalmatian turns into a fight for justice. An aggressive biker decides to attack the dog, unaware of who its owner is. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun rose slowly over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the bustling streets and soaking the city in a golden glow. The air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee and blooming jacaranda trees, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. It was one of those rare mornings when the world seemed to exhale, and for Snoop Dogg, this day felt like a much-needed break from the chaos of his life in the spotlight. Strolling through one of the quieter neighborhoods, Snoop's signature style turned heads. He wore loose-fitting cargo pants, a crisp white shirt, and a pair of aviator sunglasses that reflected the shimmering light. Around his neck hung a gold chain, not ostentatious, but still gleaming enough to make a statement. Beside him, trotting proudly, was his beloved Dalmatian, Spotty. The dog's sleek coat shimmered with perfectly defined black spots that looked like splashes of ink against a white canvas. Spotty was more than just a pet. He was Snoop's confidant, a companion who had been by his side through countless highs and lows. As they wandered into a nearby park, Snoop loosened his grip on Spotty's leash, letting the dog explore. Spotty sniffed the air, tail wagging with the kind of unbridled excitement only dogs seem to possess. Snoop smiled. He had rescued Spotty from a shelter a few years back. The pup had been skittish at first, flinching at sudden movements and unfamiliar voices. But over time, with patience and care, Spotty had blossomed into a loyal and fearless companion. Snoop watched as Spotty greeted other dogs, darting back and forth, sniffing and wagging his tail. The park was alive with energy. Joggers moving rhythmically along the paths, parents pushing strollers, and groups of friends chatting as they sipped coffee from paper cups. The energy was vibrant yet calming, and for the first time in weeks, Snoop felt himself relax. The sudden buzz of his phone snapped him out of his reverie. He glanced at the screen. It was his manager. Snoop hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yo, what's up?" he said, keeping his voice low as he kept an eye on Spotty. His manager launched into a rapid-fire update about contracts, deadlines, and appearances. Snoop's jaw tightened. Even during his supposed downtime, there were always demands. He rubbed his temple, responding with a practiced calm while silently counting down the minutes until the call would end. Spotty, oblivious to his owner's growing tension, trotted up with a stick clutched triumphantly in his mouth. Snoop chuckled, crouching down to ruffle the dog's ears. "You always know how to keep things simple, huh, boy?" The phone call ended, and Snoop pocketed the device, determined to enjoy the rest of his morning. He clipped Spotty's leash back on and let him out of the park, deciding to stop at a small cafe he frequented. The place had outdoor seating, perfect for Spotty, and served some of the best breakfast burritos in town. They turned down a quieter street lined with old brick buildings and vintage shops. The area had a charm that felt worlds away from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. Snoop liked that, liked being able to blend in, even if only for a little while. When they reached the cafe, Snoop found an empty table on the patio and tied Spotty's leash to the leg of the chair. The dog settled comfortably by his feet, his tongue lolling out as he panted in the warmth of the sun. A waitress appeared, her name tag reading Maggie, and Snoop ordered a coffee and a breakfast burrito. Maggie smiled as she bent down to pet Spotty, who responded with an enthusiastic wag of his tail. "He's beautiful," she said, scratching behind Spotty's ears. "Thanks. He's a good boy." Snoop replied, watching as Maggie disappeared back inside. It was then that he noticed them. The bikers. A group of 5, leaning against their motorcycles parked just outside the cafe. They wore matching leather vests adorned with patches and insignias that suggested they were a part of a club. Their laughter was loud, and their eyes kept drifting toward Snoop and Spotty. Snoop's instincts prickled. He'd grown up knowing when to sense trouble, and something about the way these men carried themselves set him on edge. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't here for drama. "Nice dog," one of the bikers called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Snoop didn't respond. "Too bad he's got a soft owner," another one added, prompting laughter from the rest. Spotty lifted his head, ears perking up as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Snoop took a sip of his coffee, pretending not to hear them, but he made a mental note to keep his guard up. The bikers didn't seem ready to back down, though. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up his arms, took a step closer. "Must be nice, huh?" he sneered. "Walking around like you own the place. Bet you and your dog think you're better than everyone." Spotty growled softly, and Snoop immediately placed a calming hand on the dog's back. "Relax," he muttered, more to himself than to Spotty. The biker smirked. "Looks like your dog's got more guts than you." Snoop's eyes darkened, but before he could respond, the waitress returned with his food. She glanced nervously at the bikers before setting the plate down. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her voice strained. "Yeah, we're good," Snoop replied, though his eyes never left the bikers. They lingered for a few more minutes, exchanging hushed words and glances before finally walking away. Snoop exhaled, tension easing as they disappeared down the street. But Spotty remained on alert, his gaze fixed on where the bikers had been. "Let it go, boy," Snoop said, offering the dog a piece of his breakfast burrito. "They're not worth it." What he didn't notice, however, was the biker who lingered just out of sight. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and wrapped in foil. With a quick glance around, he tossed it toward Spotty, who sniffed at it curiously before swallowing it whole. By the time Snoop turned his attention back to the dog, the biker was gone. Spotty wagged his tail, seemingly fine, but the clock had already started ticking. Snoop leaned back in his chair, savoring his meal, unaware that his peaceful morning was about to unravel in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The sun continued its slow rise over Los Angeles, bathing the streets in golden light that shimmered off storefront windows and car hoods. Snoop leaned back in his chair, savoring the last bites of his breakfast burrito, unaware that the tranquility of the morning was already beginning to unravel. Spotty, his faithful Dalmatian, sat attentively beside him, his tongue lolling as he enjoyed the occasional scrap from his owner's plate. To anyone passing by, it was a picture-perfect scene. A man and his dog enjoying a lazy morning at an outdoor cafe. But beneath the surface, currents of unease swirled, unseen but potent, waiting to surface. The earlier exchange with the bikers lingered in Snoop's mind, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that their departure hadn't been as final as it seemed. Spotty gave a soft whine, drawing Snoop's attention. "What's up, boy?" Snoop asked, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Spotty's tail thumped against the ground, but there was something about his eyes, an unease mirrored in Snoop's own gut, that made him pause. He glanced around the patio. The bikers were nowhere in sight, but the air still felt heavy. Shrugging off the feeling, Snoop drained the last of his coffee and stood, patting his thigh to signal Spotty it was time to go. "Come on, let's keep it moving," he said. As they left the cafe, Spotty's leash clinked softly against the metal chair leg where it had been secured. Snoop didn't notice the small foil wrapper lying crumpled on the ground, nor did he see the tiny smear of residue left behind on the sidewalk where Spotty had eaten something moments earlier. The walk through the neighborhood should have been peaceful. Snoop led Spotty along tree-lined streets where old brick buildings leaned against one another like old friends. Flower boxes spilled bursts of color from windowsills, and the occasional passerby smiled or nodded in greeting. Spotty trotted beside him, ears perked and tail wagging, the picture of health and contentment. But something was wrong. It started subtly. Spotty's steps slowed. At first, Snoop thought the dog had simply caught an interest in scent, something in the bushes or on the pavement. But when he tugged gently on the leash, Spotty didn't respond right away. "Come on, Spot," Snoop said, tugging again. Spotty lifted his head, but hesitated, his eyes suddenly duller than before. He let out a low whimper, one that sent an icy chill down Snoop's spine. "Hey, you okay, boy?" Snoop crouched down, running his hands over Spotty's coat, searching for signs of injury. Everything looked fine, but the dog's breathing had grown shallow, and there was a faint tremor in his legs. "Damn it," Snoop muttered, his pulse quickening. He pulled out his phone, but his hands fumbled with the screen as his growing panic made it hard to focus. Spotty let out another whimper, louder this time, and then his legs buckled. He collapsed onto the pavement, panting heavily. "No, no, no, stay with me, boy," Snoop pleaded, dropping to his knees. A small crowd began to form, drawn by the sight of the wrapper crouched beside his dog. Faces blurred together, concerned strangers offering suggestions, asking questions. But Snoop barely heard them. He needed to move. He needed help. Gathering Spotty into his arms, he stood, ignoring the weight of the dog and the ache in his muscles. People stepped aside as he pushed through the crowd, his voice breaking as he shouted for someone to call a vet. A woman pointed down the street. "2 blocks that way. There's a clinic." Snoop didn't wait to hear more. He took off at a sprint, Spotty limp in his arms. The world blurred around him. The hum of traffic, the honking of horns, the slap of his sneakers against the pavement. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He burst into the clinic, startling the receptionist behind the desk. "Help! My dog! He's sick! He just collapsed!" The receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, immediately pressed a button to summon the vet. "Bring him through here," she said, guiding Snoop into an exam room. The veterinarian entered moments later, a middle-aged woman with graying hair tied back in a bun. Her name tag read Dr. Harper. She took one look at Spotty and sprang into action. "What happened?" she demanded as she began her examination. "I don't know," Snoop said, his voice shaking. "He was fine, and then he wasn't." Dr. Harper's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Spotty's vitals, opening his mouth and peering inside. "Has he eaten anything unusual?" she asked. Snoop froze. The foil wrapper, the bikers. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I think somebody gave him something." Harper's eyes sharpened. "We'll need to act fast. I'm starting him on fluids and administering an emetic. If it's poisoning, we have a short window to flush it out." Snoop stepped back as the vet and her assistant moved in. He felt helpless, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. As he paced the room, memories flooded in. Spotty as a puppy, curled up on his lap the first night he brought him home. Spotty chasing a frisbee in the backyard, ears flapping and tongue hanging out. The thought of losing him now was unbearable. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Snoop's phone buzzed repeatedly, calls, texts, but he ignored them all. Nothing mattered except what was happening on that metal table. Finally, Dr. Harper turned to him, wiping sweat from her brow. "He's stable for now, but we're not out of the woods," she said. "We'll need to run tests to see exactly what he ingested, but I'm optimistic we caught it in time." Snoop exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Harper nodded. "Stay close. We'll know more soon." As Snoop sat down beside Spotty's cage, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by simmering anger. Someone had done this. Someone had targeted his dog, and Snoop wasn't going to let it slide. He looked down at Spotty, who stirred slightly, his tail giving the faintest wag. "We're going to get him, boy," Snoop murmured. "I promise." The sterile smell of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp and clinical, as Snoop Dogg sat hunched in a plastic chair outside the examination room. The rhythmic beeping of machines and the muffled hum of voices from the veterinary clinic's reception area felt like a distant echo, drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. Spotty lay in the other room, hooked up to IVs and monitors, fighting off the effects of whatever poison had been slipped to him. Snoop rubbed his palms together, his rings clinking softly. He was no stranger to pressure. Years in the spotlight had conditioned him to handle stress, but this felt different. This was personal. His dog, his loyal companion, was fighting for his life, and Snoop couldn't do a damn thing but wait. The minutes dragged. Snoop's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Who would do this? Why? The biker's sneers flashed through his memory, their mocking words hanging like smoke in the air. His gut told him they were behind this, but he needed more than gut feelings. He needed proof and payback. A soft whimper broke through his thoughts. Snoop's head snapped up, and he turned to see Spotty's cage through the window of the treatment room. The Dalmatian stirred weakly, his tail giving the faintest wag. Relief flooded through Snoop, but it was tempered by the sight of the tubes and wires keeping Spotty alive. The door creaked open, and Dr. Harper stepped out. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled, and there was a streak of something, maybe antiseptic or disinfectant, on her sleeve. She held the clipboard but didn't look at it, meeting Snoop's gaze instead. "He's stable," she said, her voice calm but measured. "We administered an emetic to clear his stomach, and the IV fluids are helping flush the toxins. He's not out of danger yet, but he's holding on." Snoop nodded, swallowing hard. "You said toxins? What kind? What did they give him?" Dr. Harper hesitated. "We're running tests to identify the exact substance, but based on the symptoms, dilated pupils, muscle tremors, I'd say it was likely laced with narcotics, possibly fentanyl or something similar, mixed with a chemical irritant. It wasn't an accident, Mr. Broaddus. Someone did this deliberately." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Snoop leaned back in his chair, his hands clenching into fists. "I knew it," he muttered. "I knew those fools were trouble." Harper raised an eyebrow. "You have a suspect in mind?" "Yeah," Snoop said, his voice low and tight. "A gang of bikers. Saw them earlier today, outside the cafe. They were running their mouths, making threats. One of them must have thrown something to Spotty when I wasn't looking." The veterinarian's expression shifted, concern deepening. "If that's true, you need to report this. People who would hurt an animal like that, they're dangerous." Snoop nodded, but his mind was already moving past the conversation. Reporting it was one thing. Handling it was another. He wasn't about to sit back and wait for someone else to clean this up. Dr. Harper reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. For now, your focus needs to be on Spotty. I'll do everything I can to help him, but he's going to need rest, and so are you." Rest? The word felt foreign, impossible. But Snoop forced himself to take a breath and nod. "Thanks, Doc, for real." She gave him a reassuring smile and turned back into the treatment room, leaving Snoop alone with his thoughts. Outside, the city bustled on, indifferent to his turmoil. Through the glass doors of the clinic, he could see cars whizzing by and pedestrians chatting as they strolled down the sidewalk. It was a reminder that the world didn't stop, even when yours felt like it was falling apart. Snoop pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Hank Morrison, a longtime friend and former cop turned private investigator. If anyone could help him figure out what was going on, it was Hank. The phone rang twice before Hank picked up. "Snoop, what's up, man? Thought you were on vacation." "Yeah, well, plans changed." Snoop's voice was tight. "I need your help." "What's going on?" Snoop didn't waste time. He laid out everything: the cafe, the bikers, the poisoned food. By the time he finished, Hank's tone had shifted. "Sounds like you're dealing with some real scumbags," Hank said. "I'll make some calls, see what I can dig up. But listen, Snoop, don't do anything crazy. Let me handle this." "Yeah," Snoop said, though he wasn't sure he meant it. "Just get me something to work with." After hanging up, Snoop sat back, his mind already racing ahead. He wasn't the type to sit around waiting for answers. Spotty needed justice, or maybe revenge, and Snoop intended to deliver it. A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. The receptionist peeked in. "Mr. Broadus, there's someone here to see you." Frowning, Snoop stood and followed her to the lobby. His breath caught when he saw who was waiting. It was Maggie, the waitress from the cafe. Her eyes were red, and she clutched her purse like it was a lifeline. "Snoop, I'm so sorry," she blurted out. "I didn't know they were gonna... I saw them hanging around after you left, and then I saw one of them throw something, but I didn't." Her voice broke, and she shook her head. "I didn't know it was poison." Snoop's jaw tightened. "You're sure it was them?" She nodded, tears spilling over. "I didn't know who else to tell, but those guys, they're bad news. They come in all the time, harassing people, scaring off customers, the owners too scared to do anything about it." Snoop exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "You did the right thing coming here," he said, "but you need to be careful. If they find out you talked—" "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. Snoop reached into his pocket and handed her one of his cards. "You call me if you see them again. No matter what." She nodded and hurried out the door, leaving Snoop standing in the middle of the clinic, his fists clenched at his sides. Spotty was stable, but the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Snoop turned back toward the treatment room, he felt the weight of what lay ahead settle on his shoulders. He didn't just owe it to Spotty to get justice. He owed it to every dog, every animal that couldn't fight back. And Snoop Dogg wasn't about to let them down. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Snoop Dogg paced the waiting room of the veterinary clinic. Spotty was still in the care of Dr. Harper, recovering slowly but steadily. The faint beeping of monitors from the back rooms reassured Snoop that his dog was still fighting, but the weight in his chest refused to lift. Maggie's tearful confession replayed in his head, her fear, her guilt, and the unmistakable truth that the bikers were behind this. He gritted his teeth, his thoughts sharpening into resolve. The poison wasn't an accident. It was an attack, calculated and deliberate, and Snoop was going to find out exactly who was responsible. He stepped outside, the warm Los Angeles air hitting him like a wave. The city moved around him, indifferent to the storm brewing in his mind. Pulling out his phone, he dialed Hank Morrison's number. "Hank," Snoop said as soon as his friend answered, "you got anything for me?" Hank's voice was calm but laced with concern. "I made a few calls. That biker crew? They're bad news. Go by the name Iron Fangs. Mostly small time. Extortion, illegal gambling. But lately, they've been expanding into dogfighting rings and smuggling stolen pets. They've got ties to some bigger gangs, too. Dangerous guys, Snoop. You sure you want to get mixed up in this?" Snoop's jaw tightened. "They already mixed me up in it. I'm not letting this slide." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Hank sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Listen, their hangout's an old auto shop on 5th and Broad. You'll probably find most of them there tonight, but don't do anything stupid. Let me reach out to a few people first. We can do this the right way." "The right way takes too long," Snoop snapped. "My dog almost died today. I'm not sitting on my hands while they hurt someone else." "Snoop." He hung up before Hank could finish and slid his phone into his pocket. The evening was creeping in, shadows lengthening across the sidewalk, but Snoop wasn't about to wait for the cover of night. He was done waiting. The walk to 5th and Broad was a long one, giving him plenty of time to think and fume. He thought about Spotty, fighting for his life because of some twisted game. He thought about Maggie, too scared to stand up for herself, and the other people these bikers had bullied into silence. By the time he reached the auto shop, his anger had settled into something colder, calculated. The building was exactly what he expected. Grimy walls covered in graffiti, broken windows patched with plywood, and a rusted metal roll-up door that looked like it hadn't been used properly in years. A row of motorcycles lined the front, chrome gleaming under the fading sunlight. Snoop lingered across the street, taking it all in. 2 bikers leaned against the wall, smoking cigarettes and trading jokes. Another sat on a crate, sharpening a knife that caught the light in quick, menacing flashes. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Acting on impulse would only get him hurt, or worse. He needed information first. Evidence. He ducked into a nearby alley, pressing himself against the brick wall. His eyes scanned the building, searching for a way inside. The back entrance was unguarded, a door propped open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Snoop crept closer, his footsteps muffled by the dirt and debris littering the alley. He slipped inside, the heavy scent of motor oil and gasoline hitting him immediately. The interior was dimly lit, cluttered with tools, broken parts, and stacks of crates. In the far corner, he saw them. Makeshift cages, some empty, and others occupied by frightened, whimpering dogs. Snoop's stomach churned. The animals were dirty, their fur matted and their eyes wide with fear. Some barked and snarled, while others huddled in the corners of their cages, trembling. Rage bubbled up in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't lose focus now. Pulling out his phone, he snapped photos, making sure to capture the conditions and the dogs' faces. A sharp laugh echoed from another room, followed by the clinking of bottles. Snoop ducked behind a workbench, keeping low as footsteps approached. 2 men walked in, their conversation loud enough for him to catch snippets. "Boss said we need to move the dogs tonight," one of them said. "Where to?" "Same place as last time. Fight's tomorrow, and we can't have them looking like this. Clean 'em up and make 'em mean, especially the big one. He's a moneymaker." Snoop's fist clenched. Spotty could have been one of those dogs, used, abused, and thrown away. He had to do something. But first, he needed a way out. The voices drifted farther away, and Snoop took his chance. He moved quickly but quietly, slipping back out the way he came. The night air felt sharp against his skin as he stepped into the alley, his heart pounding. He didn't stop until he was several blocks away, leaning against a lamppost to catch his breath. His phone buzzed. "Hank?" "You better have a damn good excuse for hanging up on me," Hank said. "I got more than an excuse," Snoop replied, sending Hank the photos. "I got evidence." The line went quiet for a moment. "Jesus, Snoop, this is worse than I thought." "No kidding. I'll get the cops involved, but you need to stay out of it now. If they catch you messing around that place—" "They won't," Snoop interrupted. "Just make sure they move fast." He hung up and leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky. The battle was far from over, but for the first time all day, he felt like he was gaining ground. Snoop turned and started walking, his thoughts already jumping ahead. Spotty was going to be okay. The dogs he'd seen tonight were going to be rescued. And the bikers? They were about to learn what it meant to mess with the wrong man. The night air was heavy with tension as Snoop Dogg strode purposefully toward the old auto shop where the Iron Fangs had set up their base. The photographs he had taken earlier, showing the caged dogs and the grim conditions inside, burned a hole in his pocket. He had handed over the evidence to Hank, trusting his friend to mobilize law enforcement, but the waiting was unbearable. Spotty was still under observation at the clinic, fighting to recover from the poison that had nearly ended his life. Every second that passed felt like a betrayal, like he wasn't doing enough. Snoop's instincts screamed at him to act, to take matters into his own hands, but he forced himself to hold back. He couldn't afford to be reckless. Not now. The low growl of motorcycle engines echoed through the narrow streets, pulling Snoop's attention. He ducked behind a parked car, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit alley leading to the auto shop. The bikers were gathering. One by one, they arrived, parking their bikes in a tight row outside the garage. Snoop watched from the shadows as the gang members exchanged handshakes and laughs, their voices carrying through the night. The stocky man with the tattooed neck, the same one who had kicked Spotty, stood near the entrance barking orders at the others. Snoop's blood boiled at the sight of him. He clenched his fist, nails digging into his palms, but he didn't move. Not yet. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Hank. "We're on our way," Hank said without preamble. "ETA 10 minutes. Whatever you do, don't go inside." Snoop exhaled slowly, forcing himself to nod even though Hank couldn't see him. "I hear you," Snoop replied, but his eyes never left the garage. He knew the police would handle it by the book. Arrests, evidence collection, paperwork. But there were things that wouldn't make it into the reports. Things that needed to be said, face to face. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, red and blue lights flickered in the distance, cutting through the darkness. The sound of approaching sirens sent the bikers into a frenzy. They scattered, some bolting for the back exit, others scrambling to hide incriminating evidence. But the police were ready. Squad cars screeched to a halt, blocking the exits as officers poured out, guns drawn. Commands were shouted, and the bikers quickly found themselves surrounded. Snoop stepped out of the shadows, his presence commanding even amid the chaos. The stocky man with the tattooed neck froze when he saw him, his face twisting in a sneer. "You," the biker spat. "I should have known you'd come sniffing around." Snoop's eyes narrowed. "You messed with the wrong dog." The biker lunged, but the officers were faster. They tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back as he struggled and cursed. Snoop stepped closer, his voice low and steady. You think this is over? The biker growled, spitting blood onto the pavement. You think some cops and cameras are going to stop us? No, Snoop said, his voice like steel. I think I am. The biker's eyes widened, but before he could respond, he was hauled to his feet and shoved into the back of a police car. Snoop turned his attention to the other officers, who were already rounding up the rest of the gang and cataloging the evidence. Several cages had been brought outside, their frightened occupants whimpering and barking. Maggie appeared at Snoop's side, her face pale but determined. I called as soon as I saw the cops, she said. I wanted to make sure they didn't get away. Snoop gave her a nod of approval. You did good. Real good. A familiar voice cut through the commotion. Snoop! He turned to see Hank approaching, his badge catching the light. You couldn't wait, could you? Hank said, shaking his head. Didn't have to, Snoop replied. They came to me. Hank smirked but didn't press the issue. Instead, he handed Snoop a clipboard with a list of the recovered animals. We found over a dozen dogs inside, Hank said. Most of them were stolen, and some have injuries consistent with dogfighting. It's going to take time to sort through everything, but this operation, it's done. Snoop exhaled, the weight on his chest finally easing. What about Spotty? Hank asked. He's hanging in there, Snoop said, and now he's got a reason to keep fighting. Hank clapped him on the shoulder. You did good tonight, Snoop. Real good. But Snoop wasn't thinking about himself. His eyes lingered on the cages, on the dogs who had been rescued but were still scared, still unsure of what came next. This isn't enough, Snoop said quietly. Hank frowned. What do you mean? I mean, these dogs need more than freedom. They need homes. They need someone to make sure this doesn't happen again. Hank studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're already thinking about the next step. Yeah, Snoop said, his voice firm, and I know exactly where to start. The scene began to wind down as the last of the bikers were loaded into police cars and driven away. Snoop stayed behind, helping the officers calm the rescued dogs and get them settled into crates for transport. One of the younger officers approached him, holding out a leash attached to a trembling puppy. She won't let anyone else touch her, the officer said, but I think she likes you. Snoop knelt, extending his hand slowly. The puppy sniffed his fingers, then licked them hesitantly. We'll take care of you, Snoop said softly. All of you. And as he stood, cradling the small dog in his arms, he knew that this was just the beginning. The rising sun cast soft gold across the streets of Los Angeles as Snoop Dogg stepped out of his car and approached the veterinary clinic. The air felt fresher than it had the day before, lighter somehow, as if the weight of the previous night's chaos had lifted, leaving room for hope. Inside the clinic, the sterile scent of disinfectant and dog shampoo filled the air. Nurses bustled from room to room, their white sneakers squeaking faintly against the tiled floors, but Snoop's focus was singular. Spotty. He pushed open the door to the recovery room where Dr. Harper stood beside a metal table. Spotty was lying there, his black and white coat freshly groomed, IV tubes removed, and his eyes bright with life. His tail thumped against the table the moment he saw Snoop. You're looking good, boy, Snoop said softly, moving closer and letting Spotty nuzzle his hand. He's ready to go home, Dr. Harper said with a smile. No signs of lingering damage, but he'll need a special diet for the next few weeks, along with supplements to help his liver recover fully. Snoop nodded, his relief palpable. He leaned down and buried his face in the Spotty's fur, feeling the warmth of his dog's body and the steady beat of his heart. "Thanks, Doc," he said, straightening. "You saved his life." Dr. Harper shrugged modestly. "You got him here in time. That's what saved him." Snoop filled out the final bits of paperwork, adding an extra donation to the clinic before heading toward the exit. Spotty trotted beside him, his steps lighter now that the pain and poison were gone. But as they passed through the waiting area, Snoop's thoughts shifted to the dogs he'd seen the night before, the ones still trembling in cages, waiting for someone to save them. He stopped at the reception desk. "Dr. Harper," he called back. She looked up. "What do I need to do to adopt a few more dogs?" Her eyes widened briefly, but then she smiled. "I think we can work something out." The drive home gave Snoop time to think. Spotty sat in the passenger seat, his head hanging out the window, ears flapping in the breeze. Snoop's mind, however, was racing. The arrests had stopped the immediate threat, but that wasn't enough. Those bikers hadn't just hurt Spotty. They'd built an entire operation around exploiting helpless animals. And even if the Iron Fangs were done, someone else could step in to take their place. He pulled into his driveway, but instead of heading inside, he sat in the car, scrolling through his phone. News of the arrests had already spread. The local media was hailing the police for breaking up a dangerous dogfighting ring, and Hank had even managed to keep Snoop's name out of the official reports. But that wasn't what caught Snoop's eye. It was the comments, the outpouring of support from animal lovers and activists, people demanding harsher penalties for animal cruelty and better protections for pets. An idea began to form. By the end of the week, Snoop was back at the clinic, not just to pick up the 2 dogs he'd decided to adopt, but to finalize plans for something bigger. He stood in the back room, watching as the dogs from the raid were checked, treated, and prepared for new homes. Volunteers buzzed around him, their movements efficient and focused. Dr. Harper joined him, clipboard in hand. "You're really doing this?" she asked, unable to hide the admiration in her voice. Snoop nodded. "Somebody's gotta. These dogs deserve better." He had spent the past few days securing permits, hiring contractors, and calling in favors. The result? An old warehouse he owned on the other side of town was already being renovated into a state-of-the-art animal shelter, complete with kennels, play areas, and training facilities. But it wasn't just about housing rescued animals. Snoop's vision went further. He wanted to create programs for training therapy dogs, supporting veterans, and teaching kids about responsible pet ownership. And most importantly, he wanted to provide jobs, hiring locals to help run the shelter and keep it going. "Spotty's Place," he said, pointing to the logo being painted on the warehouse wall in bright red and black. "Named it after my boy." Dr. Harper laughed. "I like it, and I think Spotty would too." Opening day drew a bigger crowd than Snoop expected. Families, dog lovers, and reporters filled the newly refurbished shelter, wandering between rows of kennels and training stations. Spotty, now fully recovered, trotted proudly beside Snoop, wearing a bright red bandana with the shelter's logo. The speeches were short, but the impact was immediate. Applications for adoptions poured in, and donations began arriving before the day even ended. Snoop watched it all with quiet satisfaction, but his mind stayed sharp, already planning the next steps. Hank approached him near the end of the event, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You pulled it off," Hank said, "and you kept your cool when it mattered most." Snoop grinned. "Told you I had it handled." "Yeah, well, let's hope you don't make a habit of taking on biker gangs," Hank replied, though his tone was light. Snoop looked down at Spotty, who wagged his tail and barked happily at a group of kids playing with a puppy. "Guess we'll see," Snoop said. As the crowd thinned out and the volunteers started cleaning up, Snoop leaned against one of the kennels, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Spotty sat beside him, looking out over the shelter like he knew it was his kingdom now. Snoop reached down, ruffling the dog's ears. "We made it, boy," he said softly. "But this is just the beginning." The lights above the shelter flickered on, casting a warm glow over the building and the animals inside. For the first time in days, Snoop felt at peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew he was ready for the next one. As the night settled in, the hum of the city faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional bark of a dog. And somewhere in the distance, far from the safety of Spotty's place, the echoes of chains and cages lingered. But they didn't scare Snoop anymore, because now he had an army of wagging tails and open hearts at his back, and nothing, not gangs, not poison, not fear, was going to stop him from protecting them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more incredible stories. Check out our other videos. You won't want to miss them. And if this story touched you, share it with your friends and family. See you in the next one.